CPT Nuggets JNCIS Security Series Administrative Access Control. Well, earlier in this Nugget series, we created a super user, M. Shannon, but guess what? That's no way near enough access control for administrative users to consider, especially on a security device. So in this nugget, we're going to dig deeper into controlling admin or management access to our security appliance, as a matter of fact, to any device, be it a Juniper router or a switch. These concepts will come in very handy. Let's check it out. Now, it's obviously a good thing to have some basic standard operating procedures when you're dealing with access controls and creating users on your J series router or on your switch. Typically, those are done by network professionals, not really security experts, but we are looking for expertise in security. So there's some things to consider when we're looking at implementing administrative configuration on a security appliance, okay? So let's just think about this right now. First of all, if you've done any type of server administration or even end user admin stuff, you probably have gotten into the habit, especially in a Windows environment, of right clicking on a program, for example, and running as the administrator or the system admin. Typically you log in with some other account besides that, okay? So we want to avoid on our SRX operating as the root user. Now early on it's unavoidable, so we're going to do it early on, but then you want to create some administrative users, some power users, and have a role-based access control approach, because obviously there's some downsides to operating as the root user. Number one, it's quite often on a medium-sized to large enterprise organization where more than one user will be simultaneously accessing the SRX. Okay, well, you really don't want to have a shared root user account, okay, just like you don't want to have a shared administrator account or a systems admin account in a network operating system environment. Really only one person will be logging in as the root user at any time, but that should be on a rare basis. So typically you're going to have a number of super users that can access that device simultaneously. And as we know, each user will have their own candidate configuration, and Junos is excellent about keeping track of that and all the changes and being able to roll back on a user by user basis. So we want to avoid sharing the root account, the root user account. It's also very difficult to do auditing and logging. We think about auditing and logging, the normal activities of end users, but we're also going to audit on a fairly regular basis our own administrators to make sure they're adhering to acceptable use policies and least privilege concepts that we have as part of our written security policy. And so we are going to, if we're doing a penetration testing, for example, or ongoing forensics, we'll need to audit those admins and log those admins. Well, it's very difficult to do if they're all using that same root user account. Okay, who logged in as root user, when and where, and what did they do? Also, we have different ways to authenticate the user. We have different types of credentials to use. We can use a clear text password. We can hash the password. We have other options as well, using a centralized remote implementation. We want to think about that, but specifically think about that as far as those other users that we create. We're going to use what are called classes. And classes are, if you're not familiar with them, are a lot like the user groups you might have in a network operating system from, let's say, Linux or Microsoft. We also want to think about just not the local administrative access to our SRX, but we want to consider the long-term ramifications of remote authentication and authorization when we create our classes. We want to think about every possible way this SRX is going to be managed. Okay, very important. Also, are you locating your SRX? Is this a small business? In our case, it is a small office. It's a remote office, branch office. But as you get beyond this and you start looking at implementing security devices in a NOC, a network operations center, or a large enterprise, you'll be considering things like TACACS Plus and Radius as your solution, which are much more scalable, they're more centralized, and you have the ability to create these classes and these constructs and apply them across dozens, even hundreds of devices. So, some things for your consideration. Okay, so let's create 3 local user accounts on our SRX, and we'll create a super user called K Barker, an operator named D Jones, and a read-only user named J Conrad. And we may create some more when we're in there. We'll just see how it goes. Let's get over into the CLI, create some local administrators, talk about the predefined user accounts, And then we'll talk some about radius support, which probably is going to be in your future if you're anything from a medium-sized enterprise on upward. Okay, so ironically, if this is really truly irony, we want to log on as the root user to be able to create these users and classes, right? So password I think was Nugget Lab, I believe. Okay, there we go. Clear this. Now, what's interesting is we've already looked at the super user account earlier in this Nugget series. I created M. Shannon as a super user. Didn't really go into too much great detail on that, but let's talk about that for a second. That's not a hard one to understand, okay? It's pretty much the administrative user. And actually, the root user, we're root at Nugget SRX here, the root user is actually, by default, part of that super user class. So it's unlimited access, it's unlimited reach into the operating system, all those good things. Now we have other classes that are going to basically going to limit, they're going to be subsets of that super user. Now, this is also important. M. Shannon is a member of the super user class, okay? Well, let me just show you, and by the way, I'm going to show you in a way that might be more familiar to you Cisco people. It's a way that you can look at things other than going into that kind of configuration hierarchy that looks like it's some type of script. So I'm going to get into edit configuration mode. I'm going to do a show system, and I'm going to pipe this to the display command, and I want to display the set commands, okay? So just show me the set commands that I did in the edit system area, okay? And we can see really quickly here's what I set, and we can see we set system login user M. Shannon, right? There's my user ID 2000, and I put myself in the class of super user, and it was a clear text password, but it got encrypted with an MD5 hash. That's a good way to look at things. If you know, for you Cisco people, it's kind of more familiar. You just see a list of the commands as opposed to if I just did show system question mark, right? All right, let's go ahead and create that first super user. It's going to be set system login, and the user is going to be K Barker. That's Keith Barker. Okay, so you probably know Keith Barker, and you know what? He is a super user. All right, so he'll be my other administrator on this SRX. I've actually known Keith since the mid-90s. We worked together at a company called Mastering Computers way back in the day, doing these big road shows, traveling all over the United States, doing, I don't know, Windows NT and Windows TCP/IP, stuff like that. So we go way back. So I'm going to make him my super user. So we're going to say login user K Barker, and what is the class? And he does have class, but that's not what we're talking about here. Okay, let's talk about these four classes here. Okay, now we know that we've got the super user. I meant that the super user is actually, the root user is part of the super user. You can see the permissions here. It says they basically have all permissions. So permissions here are kind of like a network operating system. Those are discretionary access controls. And by the way, the user, there's kind of a, I don't know, least common denominator. Like Keith Barker, he has to have a username, K Barker. He has to have a class, or you could refer to this as a group. And he needs some authentication mechanism. And there's several choices there that we're going to look at. By the way, he has the same ones available to the root user. So super user has access to all the possible commands, all the different modes on the device. Can you build custom classes? Oh yeah, absolutely. And you probably do want to do that. So we can see that the next level is the operator, and that's what we're going to make D Jones. Operator can clear, they can use network commands, they can do reset, they can do trace, they can do view. Okay. The read only, all they can do is view. Unauthorized, well, that's pretty brutal. If you're in the unauthorized class, well, you can do none of these things. You can't really do anything. And we'll say K Barker is going to be of the class super user, and then we have some choices on authentication, right? Actually, I wanted to do authentication next, so let's do authentication and a question mark. Okay, so we briefly looked at this earlier, but we need to go in a little bit detail here. A lot of times we do the plain text password option. It's fine to do that. Now notice that when you do a plain text password, it's not going to remain a plain text password. Okay, as we saw with M. Shannon, it was auto encrypted. In other words, instead of providing an encrypted password, so you could provide the encrypted password string if you wanted to do that. This way, you choose plain text password, you're inputting it in plain text, but it's going to run it through a cryptographic hash, an MD5 one-way cryptographic hash, and then we saw the results of that earlier when we did that show set command with mshannon. We can also do secure shell, which is if you're doing any type of access of this device, maybe across a network, or you've got your management VLAN that's running through the same devices, the same switch fabric as other production traffic or data traffic. If you don't have, perfect physical security, if you're not just a few feet away with a console cable, you probably want to go ahead in a production environment and use Secure Shell. Now, Secure Shell is going to use asymmetric key encryption. So it's a public key, private key methodology. And basically, you use the private key to encrypt and the public key to decrypt, or vice versa. And there's really two schools here. Most of us that are in kind of the commercial world are going to use RSA, Ravesh Shamir Adelman. That's what you use, for example, in IPsec. We're going to look at IPsec later on in this Nugget series. It's what you use. It's one of your choices to use, for example, when you're using your web browser and you're going to your banking site. You use SSL TLS. It can also use RSA, digital signatures, and those types of things. So that's a pretty common option. DSA, you see this used more often in the military or the government environment. I'm not going to tell you one is better than the other, but from a commercial standpoint, and I have way more experience with RSA, if I'm using Secure Shell, that's the choice I'm going to use. It may also depend upon your Secure Shell client as well. So if you have to access the CLI on this particular SRX remotely, then and you're only going to configure one service, SSH is definitely going to be that service, okay? And I would say SSH RSA. Now, we're going to go ahead and choose K Barker, the plain text password. We'll let it auto encrypt with MD5. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, what's interesting is you would expect that you would enter the password in now, right? That you follow it up with a password. That's not the way it works, okay? Now it asks me to put in the new password. Okay, so let's do that. And then it will ask me to retype it. And there we go. As you know, this is in the candidate configuration for the root user. We have not committed this yet, okay? So we'll have to do that. And don't forget, you have to set this up for the root account before you can do anything. You never be able, and we saw this earlier, and this is kind of part of authentication, but you cannot commit your configuration until you set this authentication up for the root user. All right, what was the other one? Well, we had D Jones as operator. So let's go ahead and do that one real quick. Put in their password. Let's do J Conrad. I can do the up arrow if I want to and just go back. Do it that way. And we'll make, well, James is my good friend, so he won't have his feelings hurt if we make him a read-only user, would he? No, he wouldn't. And we'll do authentication, same thing. Okay, I'm going to exit out of here, and yes, I want to commit my changes. Let's do a commit and quit. I'm going to exit out and come back in as J Conrad, who's a read-only, and let's kind of see what the results of that are going to be. Okay, we'll exit out of here. Exit, log in as J Conrad, password. And let's go to configuration mode. Ooh, what's up with that? Configuration mode? Aha! So I'm in operational mode. I can show stuff, okay, in operational mode, Control C, but when I try to get from operational mode into configuration mode by issuing the configuration command, it doesn't recognize the command, okay? So J Conrad, sorry James, but you're the weakest link. Goodbye. Let's go up here and clear the screen. I'm going to log back in as root. This time, let's do something kind of fun. Let's go and create our own class. How's that? So we're going to go into CLI. No problem getting into configuration mode now. Okay, and we're going to set the system login, and the class, we'll create our own class. Let's call this class, we'll just call him Junior. Okay, the class Junior, and what are we going to allow? Okay, so we can allow configuration, and the regular expression, let's say we only want to allow them to work on, how about the interfaces? Okay, so restricted access to Junior class where you can only configure the interfaces. Not bad. Now let's create another user, and let's say this user will be rbeck, and rbeck will be in the class Junior. Oops, we forgot something. I just remembered. Okay, so I need to go back and say for Junior we have to do permissions. Okay, so permissions configure. So they have to be, I have to remember to do that. Don't forget that. Okay, if you're going to do this customized, you have to create a regex that says, okay, what category can they configure? Kind of like a part of the management information base, the interfaces. Okay, and then what permissions do they have? They have permissions to configure. Okay, so, woo. Okay, now we can go and create that user. And by the way, this stuff I'm doing here was not in my JNCIA course, okay? This is a little bit extra security related stuff that really isn't covered in the JNCIA. So, you know, we're starting to get into that really security specific stuff. So, trust me, this is definitely important, especially from a real world standpoint, and it's testable. Okay, so this is going to be user jbeck, who's in the class Junior, and we're going to authenticate that user with plain text. Oops. I'm trying to go in a hurry, and it's not liking that. Again, what did I must have done it wrong the first time. Okay, so let's try it one more time and take my time. Okay, sorry about that. Let's go ahead and commit and quit. Okay, I logged out and logged back in, and I'm going to get back to the config mode, and let's go ahead and delete one of those users. We need to see how to do that, okay? And so in configuration mode, I'm going to issue the command delete, and it'll be a system area. We're going to delete a login, and the user is, how about D Jones? Okay, now adding users locally like this is one thing. If in a small lab environment, maybe in a small branch office, our office is not that small, and we do have situations where we have users coming in that are going to be maybe pharmaceutical reps, maybe contractors, temporary employees. We have doctors coming in. So let's go ahead and use something a little bit more centralized, a little bit more scalable to manage multiple devices to do authentication and authorization. Now, we have two choices, okay? So let's go back to the drawing board here and talk about a couple of our choices that we have, and then we'll look at a demonstration of how to set up the obvious choice, which would be, well, Radius. Okay, now I think the two dogs maybe exaggerates this debate a little bit. It's TACACS Plus versus Radius as far as doing remote authentication, authorization, and accounting AAA services. It's not quite as divisive as, let's say, Mac OS versus Microsoft, or historically OSPF versus ISIS. Okay, but it is a decision we have to make, and you might be asking yourself, why don't we just use Radius all the time? TACACS Plus is a Cisco proprietary option. And this is Juniper. And you know what? Maybe I should have added to that list of divisive issues, Cisco versus Juniper. But the truth of the matter is most Juniper environments at this point in time have been migrated from a Cisco environment. It's still true. As a matter of fact, as you progress through your JNCIS enterprise, for example, you will be looking at migration strategies and looking at coming from a Cisco to Juniper environment. And so the truth is, most environments may be already using Cisco's access control server, maybe 4.2 running on Windows Server 2003 or 2008. Maybe they're using ACS 5.2 running in a VMware environment, most likely. Or they're using one of the appliance options. So they're already using TACACS Plus, so you can still use TACACS Plus as your authentication, centralized authentication for your Juniper devices. Now, if they're already using Radius, well then you'll be using that option, of course. So let's just look at some of the differences here between these two. And some of these differences aren't necessarily advantages or disadvantages, okay? TACACS Plus separates the authentication from the authorization. So it's and the accounting, as a matter of fact. But it's a separate process, okay? So you'll do the authentication first, and then here comes the authorization, okay? So what Radius does is when the supplicant, we'll call it, connects through, let's say, a secure shell session to our Juniper SRX device, and then this is the client to the back-end Radius server, what's going to happen is when the credentials are supplied to the Radius server, typically the Radius server will provide, through Radius, the language of love, the authentication approval or the permit plus whatever it's authorized to do. And you still, even in a Cisco environment, but you can create the user accounts on the SRX and have the Radius server provide some of the back-end authorization. Usually, however, if you're going to use a Radius environment, you go ahead and you just create your user accounts and your groups and all that on the Radius server. Now, as I said, TACACS Plus is mostly Cisco supported, but definitely Juniper does support TACACS Plus. Radius is an open RFC standard. Another key difference, though, is that TACACS Plus uses TCP, so it's connection oriented. Okay, Radius in its default configuration uses UDP, so it's connectionless. By the way, there's some ways we can do that to get kind of a connection-oriented environment out of that, but by default, it's going to use UDP. TACACS Plus does a bidirectional CHAP. In other words, the SRX and the Radius server, they will both authenticate one another, where with Radius, it's only the Radius server that's authenticated. This is interesting. Confidentiality. TACACS Plus encrypts the entire packet. Okay, with Radius, only the password is encrypted, and the rest of the information is sent in the clear. That's an interesting thing. As far as accounting goes, remember accounting is basically, when did you start, when did you stop, and for how long did you do it, okay? And we do accounting for, billing purposes, maybe billing access to your wireless LAN to get internet access at a kiosk or an internet cafe. It could also be used most often for auditing and reporting, okay? Knowing when particular users started using services, when do they stop, auditing our administrators to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Okay, so what we're going to look at here in my environment is one that my AAA server actually is an ACS for Windows 4.2. Okay, and these are expensive solutions. So if an environment migrates and transitions from Cisco to Juniper, which is not uncommon, they may go ahead and stick with their ACS for Windows 4.2 because it's such an expensive license, it's already set up, and it already supports either Open Radius, IETF Radius with your Juniper devices, or there's even a Juniper Radius option you can choose. This is the best scenario, though, even with Juniper devices. So we'll take a look at my ACS for Windows Server real quick and see kind of what we would do on that end to set it up. It's really easy. And then we'll take a look at, we'll do a web safari and look at some of the solutions that Juniper has out there for their scalable, globally configured access control. Okay, since the configuration I'm going to do now is going to be basically just a demonstration, I don't want to permanently commit it, I'm going to do a confirmed or a commit confirmed for how about 30 minutes, okay? I don't really want to do this. I'm not going to commit this, but in 30 minutes, it'll roll me back to this point. So what are some of the things that we want to do? Well, if we're going to allow the Radius server to both authenticate and authorize this SRX and all of our devices, as a matter of fact, I would probably first go ahead and delete all my configured system login parameters. So I could do a delete system login. Then I have to create a template, all right? It's called a connection template, and this basically represents all of our Radius users. So I'm going to set the system login user. This is remote, so we're going to be, and then we say the full name of the template is, we'll call it, I like to use all capital letters when it's, something I'm creating. We'll say Radius, I'll do a dash, template. And then this is interesting. We saw this earlier, right? When we did our classes, we had the super user class, we had the operator class, we had the read-only class. We also had an unauthorized class. This is actually an example of when you would use, let me do a question mark, the unauthorized class. Okay, so when we create a new user, which we're doing here, okay, this is a remote login user template. So when we create this new user, we have to specify a class. If I don't, then I will never get to commit this. Okay, now I'm not going to commit it anyway because it's going to be rolled back in about, 26 minutes. But if I really wanted to do this in the real world, I'm not going to be able to commit. So basically what unauthorized does, it's a class with no permissions. Because actually the real permissions are going to be passed using the language of love, Radius attributes from the server. That's where I'm going to get the permissions from. So I need to go ahead and do class unauthorized here. So now I have this user remote, full name is the Radius template, that's the user, in class unauthorized. Now, I also want to set the system authentication order. And by the way, I don't want to lock myself out, so I'm going to use square brackets here. If you've done this kind of thing in Cisco, this is very similar to what we call the method list. Okay, you have up to 4 methods in Cisco that you can use, and often you'll say, group radius or group TACACS, and then the second method would be something like local, where you're going to use the local fallback, the local user database, and then maybe after that you could use the enable, the enable secret. So with that particular order, if the Radius servers aren't available, okay, it's not if your authentication fails, that's it. But if the Radius servers aren't available, then you can use a local fallback method. So it's kind of what we're going to do here. We're going to say, I'm going to do the Radius is my first option, and then password is my second option. I deleted the system logins, okay, so all of those user accounts basically got kind of wiped out, their capability. So this is the option I'll do, but I do have the ability to have a fallback on the root password, okay? So you don't want to lock yourself out. If you just did Radius here and the Radius server was not available or the link was down or whatever, I'm basically locked out. So what we have here is this, this password here. It gives me a back door in case the server is unavailable, something goes wrong over there. Okay. Now we want to go ahead and say, what is our server? What's our Radius server? So we're going to say set system, and our Radius server is at 1.1.1.1. Then we need to have a secret password. And we'll see over on the ACS for Windows Radius server, and by the way, there's so many choices for Radius servers out there. But on my Radius server, I'll have to also, when I configure this SRX as a client, I'll need to remember this password. And it should be something that's, we need a long password. But again, I'm going to be cheesy and use the same password I've been using, Nugget Lab. Okay, I'm pretty good to go on this end. Let's go over to the Radius server now. Okay, so I used an RDP session to get over to my ACS for Windows 4.2 from Cisco, my AAA server, at 1.1.1.1. Now the first thing I have to do is I have to go into the network configuration. I need to add my SRX as a client. I've already got several other AAA clients here. I've got a integrated services router, I've got a 3950 switch, an adaptive security appliance, another router, and then different various forms of authentication. TACACS Plus for Cisco iOS, and then a couple of different Radius flavors. So I'm going to add an entry here, and let's say that is, I think it was Nugget SRX, and then the IP address 192.168.1.1, and then the shared secret. Remember that has to match. It should be long, but Nugget Lab's what we're going to use here. Then we want to choose the right type of authentication. So we're not going to use TACACS plus Cisco iOS, right? We want to use Radius, and you have a couple of options. There is a Juniper Radius here, but the best thing to do is to use the Open IETF, okay? And what we'll see is we've got some different attributes, different vendor-specific attributes, VSAs, that we can use to authenticate and authorize those users. So when we're done, we'll just need to submit that and apply that. And then we've added that to our list. So the client here, remember, the client-server relationships between the Nugget SRX and this authentication server. Really the hosts that are being authenticated, we could call them, end hosts or supplicants if you want to go that far. Let's see, what else would I want to do here? That's admin control, interface. Go to the interface configuration button. We might want to go in here to the Radius IETF area and make sure that these values are going to show up. So these are all the different types of vendor-specific attributes that we can apply to these individual users, right? You can see their login services, their session timeout, their idle timeouts, the kind of things that you'd want to configure for these users. The one that's really important for us, though, is class, okay? Number 25, because we're going to apply this unauthorized class to a group. So we're just going to be applying IETF Radius attributes on a group basis, not by an individual user basis. So we should go to the group setup area, and what we would do is we would go in and we would find a available group like group 6 and then just change the name. Now I've already created a group, and this is the group that matches what we did over there, our template, right? So we're using kind of a template for these users. So I went ahead and created radius-template. Now I can edit the settings. So you can see these are the types of things, these are the things we can apply to the group members. And so once I have this group, I can go and say, we can set your day of time settings. Like you can only, let's go ahead and clear all. You can only access this device between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. Monday through Friday, let's say. So I could fill in all these little green boxes here. I can also set up some network access restrictions for this particular Radius template. I could say, look, we're only going to allow these authenticated users to access this device, okay? Not the ASA, but the Nugget SRX. So I can control the fact that these users would only be able to access this SRX and not other devices, okay? And, it's not that uncommon that you would find an organization that has a mixture of Cisco and Radius, okay? Still a lot of that out there. We can control the maximum number of sessions. Remember, these are admin users that are connecting, let's say, via secure shell, or maybe they're using JWeb. So we can control how many sessions. Right now it's unlimited, but we can say, a certain number of sessions, how many sessions are available to the users. We could even, if we wanted to, dynamically assign IP addresses from a pool. And this would be the kind of thing that you would do for, let's say, remote access users who are accessing from home, right? You've got, J. Conrad, K. Barker, D. Jones, M. Shannon, who might be accessing and configuring this SRX over the internet, right? And we could go ahead and create a pool and give them an IP address assignment. We could even download an access control rule or list to them. Here we see some TACACS Plus settings. And by the way, TACACS Plus is really good for this kind of authentication, authorization, shell access, command authorization. It's really good for that. But we would be using the proper attributes for us, which would be the IETF Radius attributes, right? And so we see quite a few of them here. Reply message, and class is important because we want to make sure and put them in the unauthorized class. So once we do that, I need to scroll down here. I'm not going to restart. I would have to restart my service, which I could do a couple of ways. I could go to the system configuration here and restart it under service control, or I could go and just restart it within Windows, this service, ACS service. Now, what I need to do, though, is I need to go to user setup, and I would create my users, right? So I would say K. Barker, and then I would add them, and then give K. Barker some credentials. And these were the credentials that K. Barker would have to provide, right? He would provide this. He would be prompted by the SRX. He would put in his password, which we'll say is Nugget Lab, and we confirm it. And then these credentials, and by the way, we can have other types of credentials, of course, but he would provide these credentials to the SRX. The SRX would pass these credentials, and we've already configured the SRX in the CLI to do this, would pass it to this ACS server at 1.1.1.1. And what we would do is I could set up individual settings for this user, but really what I'd rather do is just put this user into a group, right? So I could say K Barker is going to be a member of the Radius template group, correct? That sounds like the Knights Templar, okay, the Radius Templar group, and we'll submit that. So we've got Keith Barker. So we would go in and we would add all those users to that Radius template group, and we could authenticate our users that way. Well, that's just a basic look at using a Radius server. There's tons of other options out there. We know that. Juniper has their own options. They have a steel-belted Radius appliance. So let's go take a look at that out and do a little web safari. Okay, so I'm up at juniper.net over to the products-services area and then software. And I'm looking at Identity and Policy Controller IPC. They have several appliances, several products here for identity control, which, identity is synonymous with authentication, okay? And then policy is synonymous with authorization. So identity and policy is a fancy way of saying authentication and authorization, right? So we have the SBR, which is the Steel Belted Radius Enterprise Series, and so you can go check this out up here. A little web safari. You can compare the different models here. But the Enterprise Edition, this is an appliance, and we're not seeing any pictures here. Let me see if it's under specifications. It's a 3 or a 4 RU unit, but you can see that it runs on Windows XP through 2003. Sun Solaris and Linux. That's the system requirements. And so this would be a possible AAA Radius option for you. It's an appliance and it wouldn't be cheap, but neither are the Cisco ACS appliances. But these are two really common options for the large enterprise environment. If you just need a pure Radius server, there are plenty of open source Radius daemons out there that you can run on your Linux box, maybe on Ubuntu Linux, for example. So you don't have to go out and fork out a bunch of money for one of these appliances. But you got a Enterprise Edition and this Global Enterprise Edition, and I'm not seeing any pictures here. Let me see if I can get back to. It said compare the models, right? I mean, you can see that right there. That shows up. No pictures. Well, just go do a Google Images or something. It's just a appliance, right? It's just a box. Okay, so that's your option. One of your options for Radius from a Juniper standpoint. If you're not using it now, it's in your future. And don't forget, the next generation of Radius is called Diameter. It's going to have more options for supporting things like biometrics and single sign-on, one-time passwords, and other mechanisms. Go check it out. Okay, in this nugget of the JNCIS Security Series, we looked at administrative access control and several topics. We talked about local role-based access control accounts like superuser and operator and read-only, even the unauthorized user. We created a custom class called Junior. We also added a user to that custom class. We deleted our admin accounts and then set the SRX for connectivity to a Radius server. And then I used my Cisco ACS as a sample Radius. There's so many options out there. We took a web safari up to the Juniper option, the Steel Belted Radius server appliance. Well, I hope this CBT Nugget's been informative for you. I want to thank you for viewing.